One of the things that we talked about last week was the major difference between Western Christianity and the Aramaic Jesus. And what I said, I don't know if you even agreed with me, but what I said was that the major difference is between a legal connection with God and a relational connection with God. And that, collates to a passive or an active relationship with God. If we have just a legal relationship with God, it's basically passive. We're just following rules, we're doing what we're told, and we're waiting for a reward. So we have that reward and punishment model, that paradigm that is completely antithetical to the notion of perfect love that Jesus talks about when he is trying to show the radical nature of the Father's love. That degreeless and completely indiscriminate love evaporates in a reward and punishment paradigm. And so that legal understanding of God, contractual relationship with God, is contrasted so sharply with this relational and love relationship that Jesus talks about. The fact that God withholds nothing. So here we are praying to God for things and asking him to release them. But the truth of the matter is that God is all poured out. Everything that God has is already here. It's already now. It's already ours. And that gives us a completely different paradigm to work with. Jesus is always talking about abundance, not scarcity. Jesus is always talking about the kingdom being here, being now. It's within, it's among, it's in our midst, it's everywhere. There is nothing to wait for. If you're waiting for something, then you're not in kingdom. If you're waiting for something, you're not present because you're focused on the next moment, somewhere down the line, that will change your circumstances and make things the way that you want them to be, rather than being able just to be here now. And so this idea of an active or a passive relationship with God is huge. And I wanted to develop that further this morning because it's so important for us to see how that affects us and see how it affects our relationship with God. Passivity is the most damaging attitude that we can have in life or in our spirituality. Because if we're passive, we're always waiting for someone to save us. We're always waiting for someone else to act so that we can breathe, so that we can do the next thing that we need to do. And even if we're active in life and really a go-getter, an entrepreneur, or whatever, we can still be passive in spiritual things. And when we're passive in the spiritual areas, then we're waiting on God. Or maybe we're praying to God, as if there is no personal choice that we can make, as if there's no action that we can take ourselves. Now, I know some of you think that maybe contemplation is passive because it seems to be so static. We're trying to be quiet, we're trying to go into silence and solitude. But the truth of the matter is the hardest work we will ever do, the most active work we will ever do, is just getting to the point where we can move the distractions aside and just be here and see what is really truth. The work of contemplation is subtraction. And sometimes we connect that with passivity, but it's not the same thing. If we're waiting for God, then that implies that God is withholding something from us. That there is something that God is not going to give us until we perform to certain specifications, until we do what we're supposed to be doing. That reward and punishment model pops right back up again. But with Jesus and everything being poured out, it changes the nature of everything that we're doing. God has already acted from the beginning of time in our favor. God has already released everything that he is. It's all around us. And so God has acted. Now it's our turn. But having it be our turn is a scary thing. There's no more waiting for anything. There's no more contingencies. It's all up to us. It's up to us to act. And that's difficult for us to deal with. So many of us are afraid to deal with the trials of life, to deal with the difficulties of life directly. And so in spiritual areas especially, we hide behind religious doctrine. It's more comfortable that way. I'm sure some of you have heard of spiritual bypassing. That's kind of a way of life in the church in many ways. If we're not able, willing, and ready to deal with life on life's terms, to actually dig down deep and deal with all of the unresolved issues, whether they're emotional or whether they're psychological, the hurts and the traumas, the programs that are running down there, then sometimes we're going to lean into and use spiritual ideas and spiritual practices to kind of paper over, pretend that everything is okay, rather than doing that difficult work. That's spiritual bypassing. It's kind of a spiritual passive aggression, if you think about it in a certain way. And I wanted to read just a few signs of passive aggressive personalities and see if we can start to relate to some of this. There are certain behaviors that help identify passive-aggressive behavior. First one, a person who is passive-aggressive does not express hostility or anger openly. They express it instead by maybe leaving a note, something like that. They are masters of ambiguity, right? Of mixed messages and fence-sitting. They retain options. They retain control in that way. Blaming others, complaining. They can't take responsibility for their own failings. Chronic lateness and forgetfulness, setting rules, but then avoiding obligation. Fear of authority, fear of competition, feeling inadequate. They can be a wimp or they can be a tyrant. Fear of dependency. They are unsure of their own autonomy, and so they just try to control. There's a fear of intimacy often. Mistrustful, afraid of being revealed. They pick fights to create distance. Sometimes infidelity can be used as a means of acting out anger. Fosters chaos, leaves puzzles incomplete, leaves jobs undone. How about intentional inefficiency? I always remember that line from Bill Cosby. I've seen the boss's job and I don't want it, right? So making excuses, losing things, creates reasons for not fulfilling promises, lying, withholding information to hold on to power. Obstructionism, procrastination, won't settle on deadlines, work slowly, or deadlines don't seem to exist to this person, avoiding responsibility, resist suggestions from others, and then of course resentment and sarcasm and stubbornness and sullenness. All of these to avoid dealing with issues directly. And if you look at every one of these traits, they're all traits of a victim mentality. Why? Because a victim by definition is not responsible. A victim by definition didn't fail. A victim must be saved. A victim, most importantly, has no choice. I believe that's the defining characteristic of a victim. Not that they've been hurt, perpetrated upon, but that they had no choice in the matter. If we have no choice, we're truly a victim. But as soon as we have a choice again, even if it's not a good choice, we're not victims anymore. But this is why the victim role is so seductive. Now, we're all victims at times, especially children. Children are always victims, right? They don't have any choices. We're all victims at times. But why then does a victim mentality remain far beyond when the person regains the ability to make a choice? Because they can retain the ability to not have any responsibility or any need to act. It's like a warm blanket that you can put around yourself. The passivity is acceptable as long as they remain victims. They can blame the devil, life, parents, church, God, government, any of the perpetrators out there. But a victim, also by definition, is innocent of all failings, at least as long as they are victims. And if you think about it, an innocent is also not guilty and also not responsible. It's almost as if innocent and victim are flip sides of each other, right? And the victim can imagine themselves as innocent, which is comforting. But we're not meant to be innocent. We're not meant to certainly stay innocent. And that's something that we really need to think about. We often go back to the Garden of Eden. We think of the Garden of Eden as the ideal form of humanity. And if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned, we'd still be in that ideal state. But the garden is not our ideal state as human beings. The garden is not the finished state of human beings. The garden shows humanity at an immature stage, a non-volitional stage. We still don't have any choice. maybe even a victim stage, because everything is being done to, but there is no choice in the matter. And so the Garden of Eden story is showing us our development from childhood into adulthood, into the age of reason, into the place where we can actually make choices for ourselves and become responsible. Bar mitzvah means son of the law, but what it really meant is that child had come of age in order to be responsible under the law, because now they were of that age. So the child is innocent only until the age of reason. Then the choice comes in, and that's the part of us that's created in God's image. It's not our bodies, but the part of us that can choose. So think about this. We really don't reflect God's image until we actually eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Then we can freely choose. Because if there's no choice, there is no love. Love has to be freely chosen. Conversely, if it's not a choice, it's not a sin. You know, I sometimes get asked about the end times and the mark of the beast, if any of you are familiar with that. You know, Revelation talks about a mark. If you take it, then you're cut off from the Lord. And they're worried about the fact, can I take this mark? You know, how do I know it's the mark? You know, how do I know that I'm doing what I'm doing? I said, that's the whole point. If it's not a choice, it's not a sin. If you don't know what you're doing, how can it be counted against you? Now, I know under the legal system, ignorance of the law is no excuse, but in God's system, it's a little different. If it's not a choice, it's not a sin. We were not made to stay innocent. We were made to come into the place where we are responsible for our choices and that we can choose freely. Otherwise, we can't love as God loves. And that's a reflection of God's image. We were made here to get our uniforms dirty. We were made here to get all used up and pruny. I like to say your last check should be to the undertaker and it should bounce, right? We're supposed to pour ourselves all out to the very end. It's funny, I mean, we'd like to have our uniforms all nice and clean, except when you're a bench warmer, say. When I was in high school and I played football, I was not first string, and so I rode the bench most games. And so what we learned to do was how humiliating it was to run off back into the locker rooms after the game and have bright white neon uniforms because you didn't play a second, right? So what we learned to do was during the exercises before, get your knees into the grass, get as many grass stains and dirt stains as you could. So maybe they would give you the benefit of the doubt. Maybe you did play a few plays. Don't really remember you. It's how funny how the uniform getting dirty is a badge of honor in certain areas. And yet we fight it tooth and nail with the rest of our lives. We're supposed to get used up. We're supposed to get hurt. We're supposed to get wounded. That is what life is all about, without which there is no life, without which there is no growth. We talk about the hero's journey in here. It always begins with a wounding. If there is no wounding, there is no impetus for us to move into another world. And of course, when you apply that to child developmental psychology, there is no impetus for the child to move into the world of the adult. Why would they? It's only the hurts, it's only the neglect, it's only the realization that everybody isn't always going to be here for me and providing everything for me that then moves us forward into the world of the adult where we don't know the rules. You know, and there are dragons and witches and all kinds of things out there that we're going to have to deal with in life. But it's the wounding that takes us there. This is the way that we're supposed to be living. We're here to learn how to choose love, which means we're here to learn to identify with everyone else and with everything else. Identification with the other is love. That's what love is. And so learning to do that, learning to choose love, despite the loss of innocence, despite the loss of certainty. And isn't innocence certainty? When we are in innocence, when we can't choose, everything seems certain until it's not. And so we have this connection between innocence and certainty, and we lose them both at the same time. When we lose our innocence, we've lost our certainty that life is on our side, that things are going to be okay. And that puts the fear in place. Can we, in spite of all that, choose to be free enough to love? And so the victim really is the opposite of everything that we're created here to be. because we're created to be free. A victim is not free. And so when we look at our spirituality, when we look at our religious life even, as a form of legalism, that we have rules that we need to obey in order to be accepted by our God, when obedience becomes the highest good, simply obeying, when conformance without question to the doctrines and the culture of our groups becomes everything that we're doing, that's a passive relationship. It may sound like there's a lot of things for us to do, but it's really passive because it doesn't touch us inside. We can remain completely unchanged as we just go about conforming with everything on the outside. What Jesus is doing is showing us an active way of living out our lives and living out our spirituality, a non-passive way. He shows us this non-passive and active way of dealing with the law. He does that in Matthew 5. We talked about that in the Sermon on the Mount. He talks about how we deal with righteousness, how we deal with the interactions between each other in Matthew 6. In fact, let's take a look at that. How about Matthew 6, starting at verse 2? And let's look at the way that we typically look at these issues against the way that Jesus looks at them. And so when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. And so this idea of sounding the trumpet, the collection bins in the court of the Gentiles was like an inverted trumpet bell. It started wide at the base and then narrowed at the top, and you put the coin in. And if you took a big wad of coins and threw them down hard, it would bang down there, and everybody would look to see who put that much money in. That's sounding the trumpet. It's calling attention to yourself, trying to make everyone know exactly what you're doing and how wonderful you are. But this giving of alms is not just this passive way to meet our own needs. You could even say it's codependent in that respect. It's a way of meeting our own needs. It's a way of self-aggrandizing. It's a way of social aggrandizing, right? And it can also be a means of superstition. This whole idea that we can't outgive God. How many times have we run across people, implying or outright saying, if you give to the church, then God is going to make sure that your mortgage gets paid. That may not be that bald-faced, but that idea that you can't outgive God, that somehow if we give over here, then we're going to get over here and everything's going to pencil out on the ledger okay. That's a passive way of going about this. What Jesus is trying to turn us over to is an active identification with the other, to recognize our mutual dependence on each other, our mutual vulnerability, and to move into a space where there's just a connection that's so deep that when we're presented with need in our path, there's an automatic response to try to help in whatever way that we can. Now, just giving money, that's pretty passive when you think about it. If it's disposable for you, you can give the money. It doesn't really touch you. But giving your time is active. Now, you can intentionally do both, because what's money really? Money is time credits. You give someone your time, and they give you back money. So it's a time credit. And if you give that to somebody else, so intentionally giving money and feeling the connection and knowing what it is that is going to be done with the money and trying to help out as best you can actively. Yes, it doesn't mean you don't give money, but we can do the giving very passively, very automatically, and we can do it in such a way that we're getting other needs met. Jesus is trying to split all that apart, divorce all of that, so that the giving is pure, and it's based on this identification, this deep connection that changes everything. When I first started working with a nonprofit organization that worked for children in Mexico primarily, the founder of the organization, he would always kind of chafe when anyone came up to him and said, "Oh, bless you for your work, bless you for what you're doing." The implication being, you need to do it because I can't do it. And he always saw it as a cop-out. He always saw it as everyone needs to have an active role in the service that they provide. It doesn't mean that everyone needs to go to Mexico, but it does mean that everyone has some active role, some way of doing this so that you're not just abdicating to others and staying in this safe place where we remain untouched interiorly. We're supposed to be touched interiorly. There's supposed to be this transformation from inside out. At Matthew 6:5, Jesus starts to talk about prayer. When you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and out on the street corners so that they may be seen by men. Truly, I say to you, they have their reward in full. So what's he talking about? Well, the Jews had set times of prayer. And often the Pharisees would make sure that they were in the busiest place when it was time to pray so that they could be seen as being so righteous. And Jesus is saying, hey, when that time comes, retreat into your closet, retreat both into yourself in a contemplative sense and into a private space. Because your Father already knows what you need before you ask. So don't be using a lot of words. What is he really trying to say here about prayer? It's not a passive way for us to just try to manipulate our circumstances. I always like the analogy, you're sitting by the pool on a really hot day and you're praying to God to cool you off. All you got to do is get up and jump in the pool, right? But this is what we do all the time. We're praying for things that we already have. We're praying for things that have already been provided. God knows what we need. We don't need to use a lot of words. Jesus is saying that there's an active way of simply getting to know God if we can retreat into that space, if we can start to silently, using God's native language, just find a connection. Find that connection. This is a means of choosing abundance, being able to thrive and actually be content in all our circumstances, rather than focusing on prayer as a passive-aggressive way to try to change them. At Matthew 6:16, Jesus says, whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance so that they will be noticed by men while they are fasting. And truly I say to you, they have their rewards in full. Literally, the Pharisees would rub ashes on their face so they'd look all sunken and drawn, and they would put on faces so that everybody knew that they were fasting. Jesus said, don't do that. Brush your hair, oil it, make it shine. Don't let anyone know what it is that you're doing. Because fasting is not just a passive elimination of the negative. We were taught fasting as a way to do penance for the bad things that we did, or eliminating vice in our life. Fasting isn't about that. Fasting is an active means of focusing the mind and the body into the present moment, into God's presence. Fasting can take you there. It can make you aware of, because your body is reminding you. The meals that you're skipping and the things that you're doing are focusing you and bringing you into the moment. Because we can't live life as a negative, just taking out the things that we don't want. The way we really live is to focus and bring into our lives the positive things that we do want. The presence alone. Think about 90% of the spiritual journey is just presence. If we can get the presence, everything else will follow. Jesus said, seek first the kingdom. Kingdom is the quality of life that we have when we're living in presence. And everything else will follow. Jesus' way, the whole way of Jesus, is the laying down of the role of the victim. It's the laying down of passivity. It's the laying down of continuing to use our past hurts, the programs that are running that we're not even really aware of, as the excuse for why we are the way that we are, and absolving ourselves from the work that it's going to take to change. Think about Jesus on the cross. Was Jesus a victim on the cross? Kind of yes and no, huh? I mean, once he was nailed up there, he didn't have too many choices. But think about it. He made conscious, intentional choices at every turn leading up to his execution. There was no way that he was running away. There was no way that he was changing his basic connection with everyone. Jesus was not a victim in that sense. We have to realize that we also have this choice to partner with God as Jesus partnered with God. At Gethsemane, when he said, not my will, but your will be done, was a merging of their wills. Even though he was afraid, even though he was terrified of what was coming, he partnered with his Father. we need to be able to do the same. I remember telling that to someone, and they got really offended. And they said, that's arrogant of you to assume that you can partner with God. But what choice do we have? And what did Jesus say to us? I mean, he's constantly telling us that we can do the things that he can do. In John 14, you could look it up. If you follow my ways, if you believe, which means if you trust me, if you act as if these things that I tell you are true, active action, then you're going to do the things that I do, and greater things than these. This is a partnership. There are two Aramaic words for kingdom. One is Malkutha. That is the word that Jesus uses when he talks about the kingdom throughout the New Testament. There's another word, Mamlacha. That's used primarily in the Old Testament, and only for those kingdoms they were either Gentile kingdoms or they are apostate Jewish kings. They were the bad kingdoms. They were the dictatorial kingdoms. They were the kingdoms of one-way rule, where the despot, the authoritarian figure, the king, flowed all the commands out to the people, and they simply obeyed. That was Mamlacha. So we see Saul's kingdom being Mamlacha, but we see David's kingdom as Malkutha. And Malkutha is a two-way responsive connection. It really means the principles by which the king reigns is Malkutha. But it's establishing a reign, establishing an environment in which the people connect with the king's values, and the people actually become the king's hands and feet in carrying out the will of the king throughout the kingdom. It's not a place. It's a state of being in connection with, a partnership with. We are God's hands and feet here in this life. And when God works through us to help each other, that's the way his will is executed in this life. This is the partnership that we're talking about. Take a look at John 4, 1 John 4, at verse 16. Let's see if John can put a little finer point on this for us. We have come to know and have believed the love which God has for us. God is love, and the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. God is love. God doesn't do love. God doesn't decide when and where to do it or not do it, to withhold or to pour out. God is love. All that God is just here. If we approach it, we get it all. If we don't, then we don't. But God is love, and the one who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. That is to dwell. That is to be present to this abiding. And by this, love is perfected with us, so that we may have confidence in the day of judgment, because as he is, so also are we in this world. John is saying the exact same thing here. When we are abiding in this love, when we have so identified with God's presence, with everyone else, connecting in that way, then we are acting as God acts in this life. We are partnered with God at that point. The identification has shifted from just ourselves to everything and everyone. And making this identity shift is the hardest, most active thing that we will ever do in our lives. You can't do it passively. It can't be bestowed to you. We're going to have to dig all the way to the bone in our psyche, in our emotions, to uncover all the things that are keeping us from this kind of openness and vulnerability that allows us to so identify. It's always our choice to act in faith as if these things are true, and in full humility and in full vulnerability. This is what Jesus is trying to tell us to do. To choose to live and choose to love as God chooses as well. All poured out, nothing withheld. It's up to us to choose to accept this. But before we can do that, we have to actually see it. And before we do the work, we're all reward and punishment. Before we do the work, we're all performance-based, because that's what we see all around us. Why would we think that anything else is different? But when we do this work, when we spend this time in silence and solitude, in wordless prayer, then we start to see that there is a whole different economy under the surface, that everything is all poured out. And we can take this active role, and we don't have to remain a victim. We don't have to remain passive. I think there's another verse that also can help illustrate what's going on here at Matthew 6 also. Verse 19 this time, do not store up yourselves treasure on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, where for thieves do not break in or steal. And where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so this saying, famous saying, it sums up all the preceding teachings that Jesus has given to this point. It also introduces the next section. But here's the key for us. Ancient Eastern wealth was measured in fine clothing. It was measured in food stores, granaries, and so on and so forth. It was measured in precious metals and in jewels, and of course in land. It's not about bank accounts here. It's about real assets and real property. That's how they measured wealth. And so all of that wealth, all of that system that creates that wealth, this storing up of treasure on earth, and all of these things become a metaphor for the world system, become a metaphor for earth as we experience it every single day. It's a performance-based system. If we work hard, we get these things. If we save them and store them, we get more. Reward and punishment all over again. The question is, where do you put your heart? Because your heart is where you are going to identify. And so the heart, leba in Aramaic, not only does it mean the physical organ of the heart, it means the center of a person. It means the best part of anything, the pith, the marrow, right? The best and most central part of anything. It's the place of courage. It's the place of intelligence. It's the place of feeling. It's a place of passion. And like the eye that we talked about a few weeks ago, aina, didn't just mean the physical eye. It meant your whole way of seeing. It meant your worldview. It means the way that you look at life and feel about life, your attitude toward life. It encapsulated all of that. In the same way, heart encapsulates a person's guiding principles and philosophy for life. Everything that they use. We talked about communion here, the Dhamma, the essence, that essential part of a person that informs all their choices. That would be heart. That would be leba as well. Those guiding philosophy, the guiding principles. And most importantly, it's the point of identity. How does a person identify? Who do they see themselves as identified with? And so the question that we need to ask ourselves, and what Jesus is pointing out to us, is what are our guiding principles? What is our guiding philosophy? What's our point of identity? Who do we see ourselves connected with? And if it's with the earth, if it's with Ara, with that whole system of mammon, mamona, those things we pile up in our lives that come to identify us and define us, then we're still living a performance-based life. We're still deeply entrenched in the reward and punishment paradigm. And we have a passive view of heaven because we're always waiting for heaven. Heaven is the next life. Heaven is out there. Heaven is not yet. These are the things we deal with now. If our identity is with those material things, with all the issues of material life. But if we can make this identity shift that Jesus is talking about, if our point of identity moves to heaven, to Shemaya, which is a euphemism for God. The Jews use Shemaya as a way of not saying God's name, but referring to God. Allaha, unity, all of those ideas. God was one. God was unified. Shemaya was one and unified. If we can make this identity shift, then we become actively seeking and relating to everyone and everything through that connection, through that identity. And we can only do that through the process of stripping away everything that distracts. What are the things that distracts? Those are the treasures on earth, right? The things that preoccupy us all day long. and spin in our minds at 2:30 in the morning when we can't sleep. Now, that doesn't mean it's one or the other, because it's never dualistic in that way. We need to balance both. But as our identity shifts to heaven, to the unity, then we can see our treasures on earth and the earthly system as treasures that we use, but they are not us. We don't identify with them. We use them in the ways that we need to use anything here in this life. Because we are living between heaven and earth, between Shemaiah and Ara. And the whole goal of life is to merge the two, bring heaven to earth and earth to heaven. It's this identity shift that makes this happen, where we can live on earth, but we can have this layered effect, where we still see the oneness and the connection to everyone, and especially what Jesus calls the enemy, the one that we don't get, don't understand, and don't particularly like, but we still feel that connection, that human connection. This identity shift helps us to actively engage in shifting from earth to heaven. We don't lose the connection with earth, but we identify with this deeper connection with heaven that redefines the way we connect with earth, gives it new meaning. I wanted to read just a little bit from two Franciscans, two women. One is a nun and the other is a secular Franciscan. A secular Franciscan is one who doesn't take vows, but professes to live by the principles of the Franciscan order within their own life. And so it's just a kind of a step closer into actual religious life. This first one, Sister Joan Brown, she writes this: being a Franciscan is knowing and feeling oneself as a part of everything. Knowing and feeling oneself as a part of everything. From the smallest molecule to the tree, to the sun that was out this morning, this vast soul connection, this interweaving of us all together in a community. We're living in this time when it's not the heroes that are influencing us, it's the communal. It's all of us. And we recognize love as core to that. Love is what inspires and moves us towards justice and towards engagement in the suffering world. To transform, I believe, to be a part of the evolution of beauty in the world, which is what we're being pulled toward and into, the seeing of beauty within everything. And then Michelle Dunn writes, what appealed to me about the Franciscan life is that it's a life of prayer and action and prayer, back and forth, one feeding the other. I started down the path of becoming a secular Franciscan, and I thought, I'm going to do this prayer, and then I'm going to take action. But then I realized there was something far more basic, which was my simply being in the present moment and seeing the humanity of every person in front of me and seeing the living earth. Do you see the distinction she's making? I realized I'd gone my whole life sort of objectifying and categorizing, hardly seeing living things. I was seeing them as things. I was seeing people in categories. I had to develop a whole new awareness and ability to respond and live in the present moment so that I could be open to what is mine to do. This far more basic part is exactly what I'm trying to drive at this morning. And I think she said it so well. This far more basic part is what we're after, what Jesus is after for us. Do you remember the great poem by Rumi? Out beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. Think about that. Out beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. And when the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to think about. Language and ideas, and even the phrase each other, doesn't make any sense. Think about what he's saying there. When we get beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, when we get out beyond the performance and reward and punishment paradigm, when we get out beyond that, when those thoughts have been turned off, when we've stepped aside from that whole mechanism in our mind that thinks that way and the world system that works that way, there's a field where such ideas don't even make any sense. Even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. What is he saying? He's saying that we don't even know where we end and the other begins. We are so identified. We are so connected. We are so in love. And we don't see those kind of distinctions. We don't think in categories anymore. And Rumi was a Muslim. But when you get out into that field, there is no Muslim and Christian. There is only us, beyond any such ideas that categorize us in other ways. This is the radical place that Jesus is trying to get us. When you can love the enemy, when you don't see the distinctions anymore, you just see another human being that you feel identified with and will act in accordance with that identity. Everything changes. Identity has shifted from earth to heaven. All the preoccupations, all the obsessions, all the fears of this life, of this earthly system, just don't make any sense anymore. We literally turn a corner. We're no longer about cause and effect. We're no longer about performance for later reward. We recognize ourselves as part of the flow in this present moment, and our action as a part of that obvious flow. No more calculating. No more desire for reward even. The moment is its own reward. No fear of punishment. There is no punishment in love. No sense of right and wrong. It's just the person, the situation, the need of the moment, what love requires, and we move. We're not thinking legalistically anymore. We're just part of everything as it moves, as it flows. Now, getting to this kind of freedom, because this is total liberation, getting to the point where we can see the truth of it all is not a passive endeavor, ever, because it's not bestowed. It can't be bestowed. God can't give it to us. And I was taught as a kid, you never start a sentence with God can't, but because God gave us the freedom to choose, and because love requires a choice, we've got to choose it. God can't do it for us. It's not bestowed. We can't pray for it. But it hasn't been withheld either until we deserve it, until we performed well enough. It's just here. It's just now. This freedom, this non-victimhood, is the actual reality of life itself and the actual reality of our lives. It's all poured out. It's all around us. It's here. There is no waiting. God already made his choice to give it all away. But it's not free. I should say it's not real for us until it is freely chosen. Not forced on us, but freely accepted. Make no mistake, we're here to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not a rebellious act. It's what has to happen. We have to lose our innocence so that we can find the ability to choose freely. And that choice, that ability to choose, has made a god-awful mess of the world, right? But it's the only thing that actually saves us by bringing us back into the choice to accept what is being offered. God chose to identify with us, to see himself in us, and to see us in him. That's what love is, that identity. He's all in. All his chips are on the table. The question is, will we stop asking to be saved passively and do the active work that it takes to clear the illusion of separation, to actually see the truth that we're already saved, we're already free, we're already forgiven, and of course we're already loved. Let's pray. Father, these are really difficult truths for us because it's so far out of our regular experience. of daily life. Help us to actively seek you more deeply, to get underneath the hood of daily life, to experience this whole other reality in your presence that is all poured out, that is so different, that we can rest in and we can take assurance from, and we can know that we can afford to be vulnerable, that we can afford to be defenseless, and we can afford to identify, even with those that we don't yet trust. Help us make these small steps in that direction that will take us to new experience that'll motivate the next step and the steps after that, so that we know that we are making progress toward a whole different way of living and experiencing our lives and our moments, that our lives and our moments look more and more like kingdom every day. Father, thank you for modeling this for us. Thank you for being this for us. And never let us forget we can only love because you loved us first. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's all stand.